know, we've been working through the last 2 or 3 weeks this period of time that is what you might call the early Middle Ages, from the year 1000 up to what will be about 1300. Last week we were looking at the two lives which come at the early period of the 12th and 13th centuries, the period of time that we usually think of as the period of the Crusades. And we looked at the Crusades, of course, and then I was indicating to you that we also have these three great personalities that show up, kind of bright lights, in the midst of what is otherwise a somewhat unhappy time in the history of the church. So we looked at the first two of those last week, St. Bernard of Clairvaux, St. Francis of Assisi. The third of them is the one that we turn our attention to this morning, who is certainly by far the most famous, the most influential, and the most important, whose name is St. Thomas Aquinas. So this is a completely impossible task to try to somehow deal in any way, even modestly, adequately with St. Thomas Aquinas in the mere 45 minutes or so that we are going to be devoting to him. I was tempted when I was first kind of planning this course to spend 2 weeks on Thomas, one of which would be more or less a survey of his life, which is fascinating, and then take another week and just try to have some conversation with respect to his thought. And when I was all done and had the whole thing mapped out, we just couldn't make that additional time for treatment of St. Thomas in terms of his thought. And so I have to apologize to you that we're leaving that out as much as it would be worth our attention to do that. So anyway, this morning we're going to be looking primarily then at his life. I will be saying a couple of things more or less casually about the thought of Thomas, and we'll have to just leave it at a very inadequate and somewhat truncated, abbreviated description of his importance at the point of his great contribution intellectually. It has been said, and I think it's probably true, that if Augustine was the greatest theologian of the first 1,000 years of the church's history, then Thomas would be the greatest of the second 1,000 years. He's certainly been most important in the Roman Catholic tradition, is undoubtedly the most important architect of Roman Catholic theology, and for that reason there has been a little bit of an allergic reaction to Thomas among Protestants. And so it's somewhat rare to hear Protestants really rise in praise of Thomas, but I want to make it clear this morning that I haven't come to bury him but to praise him, that I think Thomas is a wonderful figure in church history, and notwithstanding the fact that he does give a tremendous boost to the Roman Catholic tradition, which of course, you know, I'm a Protestant, so I have to differ with him at certain points, academically and intellectually. Nevertheless, coming as he did at his moment in history, he accomplished a magnificent work, which the church was desperately in need of at that moment. And really, whether we're Protestant or Catholic, we have all been great beneficiaries of the contribution that he made. And so I want to be as friendly and sympathetic to him as we possibly can be, really appreciating the great work that he did. So anyway, with that brief introduction, then let's have a word of prayer and we'll get underway. Father, again, we are grateful that you have granted to us the opportunity to review the work that you've done through history. And this morning now, as we turn our attention to Thomas Aquinas, who was so greatly used by you at a critical time in the history of your people, we pray that we would be encouraged through our review and study of his life. And as a result of our time together, be greatly encouraged ourselves in our own life of faith and obedience and service in your kingdom. And we ask these things in the name of Christ. Amen. Thomas was born in 1225, and that's 1 year before Francis of Assisi died. So if you're keeping the chronology straight here, we surveyed the life of Francis last week, and they just overlap by 1 year. And so Thomas, of course, comes at the end of this period of time, roughly 2 centuries, that we consider the period of the Crusades. Francis had very little to say about the Crusades. Thomas did make some observations about them and was at least in a broad way sympathetic to some aspects of what the crusading spirit was all about, although he was cautious, and I'm reticent to say too much more than that about it. He certainly recognized some of the evils associated with the Crusades and was certainly capable of voicing some critique at that point. He was born in a little community called Aquina, hence Thomas Aquinas. He was born of a noble family. He was the seventh son of a Count Randolph, who was aristocratic of Lombard descent. Thomas was born in a castle. He was born into a family of some means and some wealth. So he had some of the benefits of being a noble birth and also somewhat wealthy birth. He was born at a time that was really critical for the church. This was a waning moment. There had been at the beginning of the Crusades kind of a new rallying, a new enthusiasm, you might say, but by now we're down to the last couple of Crusades. They're sort of petering out, you know. It's not any longer the great rallying point that it seemed to be earlier. There's been a loss of morale, a kind of a loss of the head of steam, if you will, that had been there earlier. And both Islam and Judaism were now mounting a new assault against the church, only now the assault was not so much coming at the point of a sword, but was coming in a much more threatening way, really, with the force of the pen. And the Islamic scholars of the day, largely given over to a kind of rising humanism and secularism, were attacking the church and showing in many ways what appeared to be naivete, in the sense in which the church was just out of date, wasn't keeping up with the times, wasn't in on the latest and most important scientific discoveries and so on, and was really in many ways embarrassing the church in a manner that the church was simply not able to respond to. And indeed, in some ways, the whole mystical tradition was sort of dodging the bullet rather than meeting head-on these assaults that were coming, sort of leaping into that mystic world, which is certainly a legitimate place for Christians to be from time to time, but there's also the place of the public square. There's also the place of the marketplace of ideas, where the Christian needs to be participating credibly in the public conversation, and that was, at least to some degree, seemed to be what the church was missing at that point. You also have, in addition to that, the general demise of feudalism, which was leading to a loss of prestige for the papacy, which had depended very heavily on the feudal kind of organization socially. Now the rise of nation states, a rise of a kind of economic class that wasn't quite so dependent on the church. All of this was really putting Christianity and the church generally at a somewhat low ebb. And it was in that context then that Thomas Aquinas is brought along and becomes part of the conversation. There's many stories related to his birth. I'm going to skip over these. You're probably aware that all of these great figures in church history tend to have a little layer of legend, you know, that comes in on top of them, and sometimes it's hard to sift out quite what is fact and what is a little bit of embellishment. I have a feeling there's a little bit of embellishment in some of the narratives concerning his birth, but there is one pretty well attested incident that took place when he was apparently about 5 years old. His family was very closely connected to the Benedictine order, and through political and economic connections had some ties to the Benedictines. And on one occasion, the family had traveled to Monte Cassino, which of course was the founding sort of mother cathedral of the Benedictine order, actually founded by Benedict himself. And while there, this was when Thomas was about 5 years old, he just astonished the scholars and the monks and the priests and so on that were congregated there at Monte Cassino with the depth of his insight, even at 5 years old. He was obviously a prodigy, and there's certainly some likelihood that he would have been able to raise questions and field questions in a way that was quite impressive to those that encountered him there. Somewhat like the story we have in the Gospel of Luke of Jesus himself, who when he comes to Jerusalem in preparation for his bar mitzvah, is there in the temple and really amazing the congregated scholars of the time with his own insight. A similar kind of incident here. In his early years, Thomas determined to become a monk, and he was especially planning to, especially at the urging of his family, to become a Benedictine monk. But at age 14, he had opportunity to go to Naples to study. and while there was brought in contact with a fairly new order in the Roman Catholic Church called the Dominicans. Now, we've touched on them separately in passing, but they were an intellectual order. They were really given more to the pursuit of education and academics, and Thomas was greatly attracted to them immediately and wanted, rather than to become a Benedictine, now that he knew that the Dominicans were in town, he was strongly, magnetically attracted to them because of his own interest in matters academic. However, his family was not at all interested in him becoming a Dominican. These new Johnny-come-latelys were not particularly respected by his family. They wanted him to become a Benedictine monk, and so they put great family pressure on him to abandon this silly idea of becoming a Dominican and be a good boy and join the Benedictines as we've always thought you would. And this really provoked the first crisis in his life because he really thought that God was calling him to the Dominicans. And so notwithstanding not only the pressure from his family, but actually the Pope himself stepped into the picture to encourage Thomas to become a Benedictine and actually promised him that if he would eventually become the abbot of Monte Cassino, which would be probably the most prestigious kind of role for a young man to aspire to with the career ambitions that were being entertained by Thomas. Nevertheless, not even the Pope could dissuade him from his belief that he should be a Dominican, and so he, against the wishes of his parents, did take the oath and join the Holy Order of the Dominicans. And at that time wrote a little apology for what he was doing, which has come down to us in the following words. Quote, "When parents are not in such want that they have a great need of the services of their children, the children can enter the religious life without the consent of their parents, and even against their expressed will, because having passed the age of puberty, any free man has the right to dispose of himself in the choice of a state of life. Above all, it is a matter of the service of God, if it is a matter of the service of God, it is better to obey the Father of spirits in order that we may live than the parents of our flesh." And so at this early stage, he's giving those kinds of philosophic assessments of the alternatives that lay before him. So he joined the Dominicans with a tragic rift with his family. I mentioned last week to you that Francis, of course, had a similar kind of difficult time with his family, and it was really out of that he joined, he became a monk and started the Franciscans eventually. Even later, when we look at the Reformers, both Martin Luther and John Calvin had difficult struggles with their families as they turned their mind and heart toward the pursuit of a religiously oriented life. So I was indicating this is not at all unusual. It's kind of an odd thing. I'm not sure quite how to describe it or explain it, but nevertheless it's out there. In any event, at 19 years old, Thomas became a Dominican. This was the year 1244. His father died 2 weeks before he took the vow to become a Dominican. But his mother was able to consolidate the family power in herself and continued to wield considerable influence with her wealth and her prestige and so on. And she was not about to just throw in the towel on this deal with her son. And so she actually cooked up a scheme with the brothers of Thomas to go and kidnap him. And so when Thomas was out in the public marketplace one day with the other brothers, all of a sudden these hooded rogues just seized him, threw him on the back of the proverbial wagon, and went racing out of town, with Thomas under their control. And so Thomas had been kidnapped by his own brothers, and the mother had said that she would disinherit those brothers if they didn't do it, so they did it, and brought Thomas back to the family castle. However, it was a several-day journey, and so on the journey they stopped along the way at a certain inn. And Thomas was put into a room where he was kind of under the guard of his brothers. And one of the brothers in particular thought, I think we could just end Thomas's whole career as a monk if we could just somehow get him to commit mortal sin. This is how these brothers were, thinking. And so they went out and they hired a young woman of the street there and brought her into the inn, gave her instructions to go into the room where Thomas was sleeping and to ply her trade. I'm just going to read to you the account of this. Quote, "A pretty young girl with all the charms of the temptress was introduced into the room where he was sleeping. He awakened. He leaped up. He grabbed hold of a flaming firebrand and chased her out, and then proceeded to trace the sign of the cross on the door with the firebrand. And from that time on, by an angelic grace, he was never to experience any impulse of the flesh again." So there you are. I have to say, whatever else, it's a remarkable story, but I think something like that probably did occur. It's a little reminiscent, of course, of the story of Joseph, if you're familiar with that in the Old Testament, when he has to rebuff the pursuit of Potiphar's wife, and he escapes in a similar kind of way. In any event, Thomas was taken back by his brothers, no mortal sin on his conscience, but was confined in this castle for about a year. And during that time, just as you recall, Francis last week had been a prisoner in his own home for some period of time. Thomas was a prisoner in his home for about a year. During that time, he was unrelenting in his obedience to the disciplines that were incumbent upon a Dominican monk, saying the prayers every day, going through all of the ritual requirements of the order of the monks, and eventually his family began to soften as they saw Thomas just not deviating at all from the performance of his religious devotion. His sister was eventually converted, and finally even his mother began to realize that maybe she had been a little bit precipitous in intervening the way she had in Thomas's life, but she was also concerned that she saved face with the rest of the family because they knew she'd been the instigator of this deal. And so she actually cooked up another scheme to assist him to escape. She didn't tell anybody about it, but she just made a kind of created an opportunity, and as the story goes, in any event, Thomas escaped through a window of the castle, was let down the wall, and was able to go back to his Dominican life. So that early rift with his family apparently was healed, at least to some extent, at that point. He left at that point and went to Paris, where he studied for 3 years and distinguished himself so much as a young student of theology and so on that he was able to acquire a place in the most prestigious school of Christianity of the day, which was at Cologne and was led by the most famous theologian of the day, whose name was Albertus Magnus, or Albert the Great. It's interesting that really one of the ironies of history, we don't hear much of Albert the Great. He was a masterful theologian, a great, very productive writer and teacher and so on, but he was so eclipsed by his greatest student that we virtually never hear of him. I think if there'd never been a Thomas Aquinas, our lecture this morning would have been, first Bernard and then Francis and then Albertus Magnus. He would have been the great thinker of the day, but he was so completely, as I say, superseded by his greatest student that we rarely hear of him. But in any event, he was a brilliant and sensitive scholar, and it was quite a privilege for Thomas to be able to be accepted at such a young age into the school that was led by Albertus Magnus. However, Thomas's first experience at the school was not particularly pleasant. As we're going to see a little later, Thomas himself was a big man and kind of a lumbering sort of guy. In fact, the picture that comes to my mind, if you're familiar with, is it Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men? Who is it? What's the name of the big guy? Lenny, is that it? Yeah, and anyway, the picture is sort of, I think that's what Thomas looked like. Very big, but he didn't look very bright. He looked like a big, kind of dumb guy, and so that's what the students assessed him to be. And they mocked him. He was kind of slow, it seemed, and lumbered around and didn't seem to be very bright. And they kind of wondered, what is this, a remedial program? How did he get into this school? But anyway, they began to call him names and mock him and so on. And that was where his great nickname in history actually came from, because they called him the Big Dumb Ox of Sicily. And so that was their Christian, charity toward him. And to this day, you'll sometimes hear Thomas Aquinas called the dumb ox. Of course, the irony of it is just appalling, but there you are. In any event, that was the name that was attached to him, and it stuck for a little while. But as was the requirement typically of that kind of educational process, an occasion came when each of the students was to write a paper and present it and defend it in class. And so this was Thomas's first opportunity to generate a paper on some thesis and to get up and present in class this particular paper. And so he did so. He stood up and made his presentation, and all of the other students in the room sat in absolutely stunned astonishment as they listened to the breadth and the depth of the learning that was reflected in this modest paper. At the end of his presentation, there was supposed to be a critique, debate, raising on hard questions, challenging. The whole class was silent. Nobody could say a word. And finally, Thomas kind of lumbered back over and sat in his chair. And there was silence in the room for a little while, at which time Albertus himself stood up and broke the silence with the following words, quote, "Gentlemen, it seems as though this dumb ox of Sicily will one day, through the power of his mind, turn the world upside down to the glory of God." And obviously at that moment, the assessment both of Albertus and of all of the students changed radically and permanently. But in any event, Thomas did complete his studies under Albertus and distinguished himself as the finest student that had ever come through that school. Was immediately given a teaching assignment, teaching what are called the sentences of Peter Lombard. This was a classic work in theology. It was kind of a beginning work, an introduction to theology, the sentences of Peter Lombard. In fact, Martin Luther himself began his career as a teacher teaching the sentences of Peter Lombard. So this was a very common and standard work. But shortly thereafter, in fact, at age 31, Thomas was promoted to what was called a Master of Theology. Now, Master of Theology probably doesn't hit us as a very big deal, but at that time, this was a rare and singular honor. In fact, ordinarily, a person was not even considered for such a role until they were 35, and usually then it was many years after that before they would actually have that dignity conferred upon them. Thomas, here at age 31, through a papal dispensation, was given prematurely because it was so manifestly appropriate, this particular honor of being a Master of Theology, which had with it then an incident to that was a permanent teaching position. Thomas was quite reluctant to accept it. He was impressed with the responsibility that was connected with being a Master of Theology. That put him really in the front ranks of being a teacher of the church and defender of the church. And as great as his learning was and his genius was so evident to others, he himself was rather blind to it and felt completely inadequate and ill-equipped to shoulder that kind of responsibility. He retreated during those days to fasting and prayer and tears and weeping, in which he was lamenting that it had come to this, that somebody the likes of him would actually be installed in such a position when he obviously lacked the necessary learning and competence. So whatever else we think about Thomas in terms of his intellect, his modesty and his genuine humility are one of the most remarkable things about him as well. But in any event, at the great urging of his peers and compatriots and superiors in his order, he did finally acquiesce into this request and took a teaching position at the mountain of St. Genevieve. And it was there that he taught, and that was really the remainder of his career. He worked and taught wrote and was very prolific, of course, throughout the rest of his life. All of that, more or less, from the teaching position at the mountain of St. Genevieve. Almost overnight, he became famous. People came from all over the Christian world to sit at his feet. They sat in the straw, listening to him, taking notes, asking questions, and otherwise absorbing the great contribution that he could make. He was a man of just unparalleled genius. He would dictate books, and virtually they would be publishable while the ink was still wet on the page. He would dictate them, and because he could dictate much faster than any secretary could take it down, he would actually dictate commonly to 4 secretaries at once. These are monks who would take down dictation. So he could dictate 4 books on 4 separate subjects simultaneously. Number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. Then back to number 1, number 2. And that was just the great genius of his mind, that he could put out these remarkable displays of Christian apologetics and philosophy with that kind of rapidity. He was asked, and probably the thing that has made him most famous in the history of the church was the request that he take up studies of Aristotle. We mentioned earlier in this course that Augustine, of course, was heavily influenced by Plato, and you might say that medieval Christianity was bearing the imprint of the Platonic Augustinian theology all through those years. And really the assault that was being brought to bear from Islamic sources and others, representing a kind of secular spirit of the age that was really rising then and was going to initially or eventually kind of bloom in the Renaissance, the tool that was being used by some of these critics was the philosophy of Aristotle. Just as Aristotle had been the critic of Plato, so now these, using Aristotelian categories and logic, were becoming the critics of a church that had been deeply imprinted by a Platonic philosophy. And so it seemed that nobody wanted to touch Aristotle. He looked like the enemy. He looked like the one that was the undoing of the church, and he'd been treated with some degree of fear. But now finally the recognition struck everybody that maybe Thomas would be the one who could finally read, study, digest, and make Aristotle serviceable in the life of the church. And so that's exactly what he did, and he began to take up the study of Aristotle and incorporate Aristotelian thoughts and categories and distinctions into the theology of the church, which is why, to this day, Roman Catholic theology many times articulates its theology in Aristotelian terms. If you know the doctrine, for example, of transubstantiation in the Catholic Church, they would say that the substance of bread and wine become the substance of the body and blood of Christ, but the accidents remains the same. Well, that jargon is Aristotelian, but it was Thomas who took those terms and incorporated them and made them serviceable in the church. And that kind of thing, this is a very simple example, but that was the sort of thing that took place. What was happening in the church was that the assault that was coming was raising questions about the credibility of the church in certain positions that she had taken on certain subjects. And so what did the church do with that? Rather than meeting the challenge head on and asking the question, boy, did we really get that right? Has the discovery here in philosophy or science or natural thought or something given us some new information that we should be taking back to our theological musings and maybe taking seriously? Rather, the church just kind of closed ranks and just refused to face it, and that was giving rise to this sort of mystical impulse to rather, as it were, escape from the debate rather than meet it head on. That's always a temptation in church history. This isn't quite the time frame, but something like it happens later when you have a guy like Copernicus coming along saying, I think that our old idea that the earth is at the center of the universe and everything's revolving around the earth isn't quite right. And he begins to postulate a heliocentric universe. And the church said, well, you're a heretic. And then Galileo comes along later and says, boy, if you look through this telescope, it sure looks to me like Copernicus got it right, and so how does the church deal with Galileo? You're a heretic. You see, and the bishops won't even go look through his telescope. This is not the way the church should be responding to proper, appropriate, legitimate science. We don't have to just anathematize those, but it does create a kind of fragmentation in our view of learning. And that was what was happening in Thomas's day. You might say that there was a theological truth over here and then natural truth over here. And nobody tried to draw lines that connected the two. So you could believe something was true here and yet false over here. And the kind of intellectual dishonesty that was going on was really becoming embarrassing and embarrassment to the church. And so this is really the culture, the climate in which Thomas was asked to do his work. And his whole philosophical effort in some ways, if I can put it much, much too simply, was that he was attempting to show that truth is God's truth. If you find that truth in the Bible, it is God's truth. If you find that truth in a test tube, it is still God's truth. The truth is a united thing, and there is a kind of coherence to it, so that regardless of where you find it or from what source, truth belongs to God. And Thomas developed a whole philosophy in which he was attempting to show the integration of truth rather than the fragmentation of it. And this was a huge, helpful contribution that I think all Christian people can be greatly helped by, understanding and reflecting on. I have to say, I think contemporary Christianity could greatly use a new Thomas Aquinas, because I think we have the same kind of thing going on, sort of leaping into a pietistic world of mystical faith and avoiding the debate, believing things are true there while they may be false over there. I don't see any Thomases on the horizon yet, but I'm certainly hopeful one may come. But in any event, that was at least in terms of his intellectual contribution, probably the thing for which he's remembered the most, although certainly that doesn't even begin to touch the depth of the contribution he made in a broader sense. Let me shift here for a moment to more of a personal and kind of anecdotal review of some of the things about Thomas that I think you'll find interesting. I indicated to you earlier that in terms of his personal appearance, he wasn't exactly what you'd look at and conceive of as a genius, at least at first appearance, and so on. He was a man. He was described as being one of lofty stature, large, big, dark, and the nicely worded description of his kind of size was quite portly. So I'll let you fill in whatever descriptive adjective you think may actually fit there, but he was a big guy. That was one thing. He was said to stand erect. He was quite tanned, and he had what was described as an unusually large head, upon which there was very little hair. He had a kind of one of those fringes around the edge, it seems, but was basically bald otherwise. He was described by his contemporaries as absent-minded in the extreme, which I always take great comfort in hearing. His absent-mindedness always gives me some degree of encouragement. He was probably the original absent-minded professor. I think probably that phrase originated with Thomas Aquinas. In fact, in his order of monks, there were a little group of monks whose task it was to simply follow Thomas around and keep him from committing social blunders, because he was so absent-minded and really oblivious to his surroundings. Probably the most famous incident of this nature was when he was having dinner once, and a very honored guest of the king himself, King Louis, had invited Thomas and some of the brothers over for dinner. This is a big deal, to have dinner with the king. And so while Thomas was sitting there and the king was trying to engage in conversation with this very famous man, Thomas Aquinas, and ask him some questions, Thomas was obviously just somewhere else. He was oblivious. He was answering without even quite seeming to be paying attention. The brothers were just chagrined and embarrassed. They were trying to kick him under the table. Thomas, wake up. This is the king, for Pete's sake. And Thomas was just more or less seemed to not be paying much attention at all, until just out of the blue, quite unexpectedly, he slammed his hand down on the table. Wham! And all of the dishes rattled and everything. And he cries out, "I've got it! The clinching argument against the Manichaean heresy." The brothers are going, the Manichaean heresy, what does that have to do with anything? But King Louis actually was far more cordial and appreciative than probably the brothers were on that occasion, and immediately recognized that this was what made Thomas great, was that his mind was so probing and never shut off. And so the king immediately called a secretary to come in and take down in dictation whatever this insight of genius was that had just come to the mind of the great Thomas Aquinas. I might say, by the way, that some of the cardinals in the church were not quite as appreciative of this aspect of Thomas as was the king, and some of them who were quite impressed with the degree of honor that they should be accorded were sometimes highly insulted, because Thomas was actually almost oblivious to rank in the church or outside of it. It just was not on his agenda, and he didn't seem to have much of a sense of when you were supposed to curtsy, in the overall socio-economic life of the church. So in any event, this was an interesting little feature of his life. But when it came to the pursuit of truth, you could only say of him that he was something of a monomaniac. He was completely devoted, constantly in pursuit of the truth of God and the truth of Christian teaching. He was not characterized by any hobbies, any games, any recreations of any kind. He was just a person that seemed, from the time he was up in the morning to retiring at night, one that was just determined to keep probing the depths of the truth of God. There is one occasion in which he was traveling to Paris, and actually the brothers had encouraged and persuaded him and finally prevailed upon him to take a little time off to see the sights. I mean, you're in Paris, for crying out loud. And so they took him out on the streets, and they're walking up and down the streets. And one of the brothers, who had such deep appreciation for Thomas, in an effort to just express the depth of his affection for Thomas, made the passing comment to him, Thomas, I just wish I could give you this whole city as a gift. And Thomas replied quite sincerely, quote, "In truth, at this moment, I would prefer to have the homilies of Chrysostom on St. Matthew." So Thomas was, give him a set of commentaries any day, as opposed to touring France or Europe or Paris. But in any event, he was a man of remarkable humility and modesty. There's no trace whatsoever of him ever seeking after fame, ever desiring it. He was a humble servant of the church throughout his life. There's no evidence of any kind of arrogance. He never at any time wore the kind of garments that would be accorded a great scholar, a great prestigious person. He always looked like a simple monk, and that was the way he dressed. In fact, on one occasion, that caused some confusion and embarrassment, because he was actually taking a little walk through the monastery and was encountered by a visiting monk who was there from another monastery, was only going to be there for a few days, who did not know Thomas Aquinas by sight, had obviously heard of him, but didn't know what he looked like, and would not have assumed that he would just dress like any other monk. Well, this visiting monk had instructions from the abbot of the monastery to go into town, grab the first monk he saw, and have them go with him into town to get some groceries. And so this visiting monk, first guy he sees is Thomas, who's a big guy. He figures, well, he can carry a good, heavy load, and so he commands Thomas immediately to follow him. And Thomas doesn't protest, doesn't say, don't you know I'm Thomas Aquinas, the most famous guy in the world, or anything like that. He just immediately, very humbly, modestly follows the man, and the guy kind of keeps telling him to speed up a little bit, you're going too slow, and they go into town, they buy these groceries, and Thomas very humbly carries them back, and only after the monk got back did he realize that he had just solicited the assistance of Thomas Aquinas to do this project, and he thought it was going to be off with his head, but Thomas was completely cordial, and in fact, it really bore out one of the basic principles that came through not only in Thomas' writing and teaching, but in his life, that obedience to other people is in some ways the deepest expression of our obedience to Christ. He said, in fact, these words, quote, "Obedience is that in which the whole religious life is summed up. Obedience to Christ can only be shown by a man's willingness to submit himself to the authority of other men." And Thomas didn't simply write that kind of thing, but he was very much the embodiment of it. He was known as being a very naive man, and so the irony is, in spite of his great, powerful intellect, He was the victim of merciless jokes and practical jokes constantly. Probably the most famous of these was, on one occasion, a monk or a brother was standing at the window in the area where Thomas was working, and there were some other monks in there as well, and all of a sudden this monk just cries out, "Thomas, come quickly! There's a flying ox out here." Thomas gets up from his work, interrupts whatever deep thing he's doing, walks over to the window to look out and see this phenomenon of a flying ox. And, of course, as soon as all the other brothers saw him fall for that, they just broke out in laughing. They couldn't believe it. "Thomas, how can you be so foolish? Why would you interrupt your work to go over and see a flying ox?" To which Thomas gave this famous reply, quote, "It is better to think that an ox could fly than that a monk could lie." So, Thomas, I think, won that one in the end. Thomas was famous for his preaching. He was not simply a dry academic, a kind of cerebral guy, but when you got him behind a pulpit, he was a powerful preacher of the Word of God. In fact, there's occasions where it is reputed that he would be preaching and the people would be so seized with the emotion and moved by the content of his sermon that they would actually be weeping to such an extent that Thomas had to wait for a while for things to quiet down in order for him to continue his sermon, which in fact also happens on other occasions. In fact, there's a very famous preacher in American history for whom that same description applies. Who is that, by the way? Jonathan Edwards is right, who would read his sermons in a kind of high-pitched monotone. He read right out the manuscript, and yet his sermons were so powerful that people would just be, weeping loudly in the sermons and in the services. He'd have to quiet them down before he could continue. So that wasn't, Edwards' experience was not unprecedented, since Thomas had a similar kind of experience as well. Thomas was, even though he was academic and even though he was engaged in the, you might say, public defense of the church, nevertheless, he also was deeply touched by the mystical tradition, going back to especially Bernard of Clairvaux. And he was described by many of his contemporaries as living in a kind of perpetual rapture or ecstasy that resulted mostly from his life of prayer. His closest assistant throughout his life was a man named Reginald. And Reginald made the comment that each of the carefully worded syllogisms that would show up in his academic writings was produced as much by the earnestness of his prayer as by the application of his mind. And it really does seem to be the case that was descriptive of him. Reginald said these words, quote, "As long as he was living, my master prevented me from revealing the marvels that I witnessed. He owed his knowledge less to the effort of his mind than to the power of his prayer. Every time he wanted to study, discuss, teach, write, or dictate, he first had recourse to the privacy of prayer, weeping before God in order to discover the truth of the divine secrets. I often told that often as he celebrated the Mass in the chapel of the monastery, he would break down into tears, sometimes noticeably." And so not only was he a man of great mind, he was a man of great heart. And the heart was very much a part of his life of worship and devotion, and he was certainly anything but a dry academic or intellectual. Probably the most, certainly controversial, and I'll say incredible, of the stories that comes to us concerning his life of prayer is one that is reported to us third hand, but it comes from Reginald, who's generally a pretty reliable source. And so there's been a considerable interest in just what this seems to reflect. But I'm just going to read it to you again without comment. I'll just let you assess what you want from it. But it's this rather well-known occasion in Thomas's life. As follows, quote, "An obscure passage had stopped him in Isaiah, and for a long time he fasted and prayed to obtain an understanding of it." So even Thomas could get stymied. Here he was stuck writing on Isaiah. He couldn't figure out this one text, and so he was stuck there. "And behold, one night Reginald heard him speaking with someone in his room. But when the sound of the conversation had ceased, Friar Thomas called him, telling him to light the candle and take the manuscript on Isaiah. Then he dictated for about an hour, after which he sent Reginald back to bed. But Reginald fell on his knees, saying, "I will not rise from my knees until you have told me the name of him or of them with whom you have spoken for such a long time tonight." Finally, Friar Thomas began to weep, and forbidding him in the name of God to reveal the thing during Thomas's life, he confessed that the apostles Peter and Paul had come to his cell to instruct him on the passage. So there you are. I'm not going to deny it or affirm it, just report it, that was part of the story that came there in his life of service. The final crisis in the life of Thomas came in the year 1273. He was celebrating the Mass on December 6th in the chapel of St. Nicholas, and he had a kind of pivotal, mystical experience of some kind that's never been quite understood. But following that moment, he quit his writing, he quit his preaching, he quit dictating, he quit teaching. And from that point on, he simply told his friends, "I can do no more." Reginald himself finally kind of pressed him as to what was the explanation for this. And Thomas said to him reportedly, quote, "Reginald, such things have been revealed to me that all I have written now seems to me like so much straw." And at that point, it seemed all he could do was just wait out the rest of his days in a relative silence. It reminds me a little bit, not exactly the same kind of thing, but the Apostle Paul writes to the Corinthians on one occasion and tells them about having been caught up to the third heaven, having seen things it was not lawful for a man to speak. And that's all shrouded in mystery, but you wonder if it was a similar kind of thing. In any event, Thomas, from that point on, basically just lived in a kind of stupefied state. There was very little more that he did. He was only a few months later, 2 or 3 months later, summoned by the Pope, Gregory X, to come to Lyon to bring his mind to the task of dealing with some of the pressing issues of the church at that time. As he was traveling, he collapsed on the way, and he happened to collapse not too far from a Benedictine monastery. And so he was immediately taken into that monastery and given shelter and comfort there. And the brothers that lived there in the monastery viewed it as a huge honor to have the great Thomas Aquinas actually there in their monastery. For his part, Thomas himself felt this was something of a homecoming, that his family had originally wanted him to be a Benedictine. His entire life had been as a Dominican, but now at this particular juncture, here he was back in a Benedictine monastery. Usually it was wintertime, and usually, of course, they would have beasts of burden carry the wood to heat the various rooms and so on, but the monks were so honored to have Thomas there that they actually took turns carrying the wood themselves that would be used to heat the room in which Thomas was resting and attempting to recover. But in spite of all of that, on March 7th, at the age of merely 49 years old, Thomas Aquinas died. And that was the end of that very remarkable and stellar life in the history of the church. Shortly after his death, he was canonized as a saint in the Roman Catholic Church. The title that was conferred upon him at that point was Doctor Angelicus, Doctor of the Angels, and that name, of course, stuck with him to this day. No one has ever been cited any more frequently than Thomas Aquinas in papal encyclicals. And as I say, Protestants have sometimes been a little bit harsh in their judgments toward Thomas, largely because obviously he does offer a great deal of the theological infrastructure that we find within the Roman Catholic teaching, and certainly I would at points have to differ, in terms of the conclusions that he reached. But I think there is a broader truth to the man that must not be underestimated, that in some ways he gave a great service to all of Christianity, and even those who were viewed as his critics, people like Luther or Calvin or others, readily acknowledged the greatness of his mind and the greatness of his contribution and of his insight.